Story 1. I was born with superhuman abilities. I was never what you would call normal. My name is Dylan, and from the time I was born I had unmatched strength. My father said he discovered it for the first time when I was 3 years old. We were wrestling in the living room and I threw him through the drywall. He broke his wrist and had a few marks on him, but he recovered just fine. My parents were always supportive and encouraged me to harness my abilities. I was homeschooled and was never allowed to participate in sports or social events. From an early age, they had a strange curriculum for me. I would learn anger management above any other subject, and then practice controlling my strength. Sometimes I would get frustrated, but it was never really a big deal. I understood there was a reason I couldn't play sports or interact with other kids my age. Eventually I turned 18 and was considering a higher education. My parents understood my wants, though they tried their best to talk me out of it. I explained that I was done being kept behind walls and wanted to explore the world. I wish I didn't. Before I enrolled in college, I decided to take a trip. I didn't go anywhere too huge, just right outside my hometown to explore the world. Oh, it was lovely. The sun sets, the warm sand under my feet as I walk through the beaches. Conversations with people who weren't my parents or their friends. All of it was just so nice. What I didn't know about Weaver were bullies. Well, I knew of them. My father had lesson plans dedicated to them and how I could and should defend people from them, while assuring not to deal any physical harm unless somebody's leaf. He was in immediate danger. Well, one day I was at the mall and had just finished watching a movie at the theater. I was sitting on a small bench just a few feet from the entrance. A few women were walking by and I made eye contact with one of them and we smiled at each other as they passed. A large group of men were coming from the other direction. They were very enthusiastic, to say the least, and all began shouting cat calls. I rolled my eyes and continued listening to their corny pickup lines. I was curious how people interacted and wanted to observe everything I could before I moved across the state. It was clear that the women weren't interested and tried to make their way past the men and into the theater. That's when things took a bad turn. The group wouldn't let them pass and were becoming more aggressive with their pickup lines and attempts to wow them. I heard a woman say in an annoyed tone, "Okay, stop. We just want to go see our movie." I chuckled and felt for the men. One of my father's lessons was that sometimes in life you will simply get rejected, whether it's by a woman who's not into you, a rejected promotion or job application, a teacher giving you a grade below what you think it's worth. Whomever it may be, sometimes things just won't go your way in life, and that's okay. It's up to you to control where your day will go from there. I thought that would be a lesson that everybody was taught, an obvious moral compass. I was wrong. I saw one of the men grab one of the women by her wrist and start to get angry. She yelled for the man to stop, but he insisted that she listen to him. I walked over and attempted to break up the little scene that had been created. He let go of her wrist and spun to face me. He was so incredibly angry and unhinged, and I had no clue why. Was it his pride? Was he embarrassed that the women weren't into him or his friends? I had a problem processing the situation because it seemed to be of such little importance. I apologized if I'd upset him. Then I explained that him and his friend should just go because these women were clearly going to be late for their movie. He licked his lips and rolled his shoulders in a manner that suggested he was angry enough to become physical with me. Again, I had no clue why, but his friends seemed to know something I didn't because they shouted and encouraged the entire situation. I shrugged and turned to the women, gesturing to the door and explaining that they should just go see their movie. I turned around to try and defuse the situation, but the man was already bouncing around and holding his hands in front of him as if he thought I was going to try and fight him. All of his friends were holding cell phones and screaming for the man to, and I quote, beat my ass. I turned over to the women to encourage them to go inside once more, and to my surprise, majority of them were also recording the situation on earphones. How did that happen? I went from trying to defuse a situation to becoming the center focus of a fight that I wanted no part of. I wasn't going to go against my parents' lifelong teachings the first time I went out in the world. So I did what I think everyone should do in a situation where violence is simply not needed. I turned and began walking away. I heard his feet scratch the floor and his footsteps patter towards me. I spun around and saw him running at me with his fist held back, ready for a punch. Now, my reflexes have always been a tad bit above the average human, so I watched him come at me and thought about my best move. A full sprint to me, when I apply my full training, looks like a fast-paced walk. When he finally reached me, I placed my hands in pockets and closed my eyes to this man's. He must have been an athlete, because I vaguely felt his knuckles make contact with my jaw. I heard the people screaming and cheering, and I looked at the man who'd punched me. I felt an instant regret. When I saw him holding his hand, he kept his composure and continued to insult me. But anyone who was there would be able to see that his wrist was clearly broken. Why didn't he just walk away? Was this really the world I was kept from? Angry and bitter people who turned to violence and insults over the littlest of things. I wish I could say that the whole thing ended there, but that'd be something I could handle. After the man had punched me, he stumbled back and pulled a gun from his waistband. At this time, a group of girls began screaming and sprinted inside the movie theater. His friends screamed at him to put the gun away, but I didn't think they cared either way because they kept their phones in their hands. I looked him in the eye and pleaded with him, saying, please put the gun away. I don't want anyone to get hurt, and I don't want to hurt you. I had no clue that everything people say sounds like a challenge to the outside world. I saw red and blue lights light up the walls around us, and before I knew it, the entire place was covered with police cars. The man's Ians ran as soon as they saw the cops approach, but he stayed right where he was, staring at me with malice and holding the barrel of his gun centered with my head. A few officers stepped out of their cars and pulled their weapons out, aiming at the man and demanding that he drop his weapon and get down on his knees. What have I done? I didn't want any of this to happen. My father always told me that no matter what happens or who is around, not to judge or make harsh decisions. People are mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles, friends, all I could. Think at moment was no matter how this ended. The man in front of me was losing a part of his life. If he pulled the trigger, I'd be perfectly fine, but the officers around us wool. Fire at him and he'd lose his life. If on the other hand he surrendered, he'd be going to prison for many years, and if he did have a wife or a son, they'd lose a husband and a father regardless of how this night ended. What have you done? I asked with remorse. He didn't say a word. He just stood there thinking about his next move. That's when I saw it. He was squeezing the trigger. My adrenaline shot up, and everything moved in slow. I turned back to the man and sprinted towards him. As I made it over to him, I grabbed the bullet from the air and tried to kick him out of the oncoming fire from the officers. When I finally calmed down, I turned to see all the officers staring at me with dropped jaws. I felt a cold rush come over me, and I turned to see if the man was okay. He was over 50 yards away, on the other side of the plaza. I ran over to him and picked him up. I began to cry and screamed for the officers to call an ambulance. I refused to give a stat. Emmett and the officers didn't seem to mind. They figured no one would believe the situation anyway. They were all happy that no one was killed and considered the night to be a success. I disagreed. The man lived, but he'd be paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life with little motion in his arms. He would be unable to make love, play sports with his children, or even basic tasks without added difficulty. I felt awful, like everything I was taught was just thrown away. I moved down south and worked for a small warehouse. I make a decent living since I have no social life and am able to pick up extra shifts without breaking any kind of a sweat. I still sit awake at night and think back to the moment when I kicked the man. The scariest thing for me is, for a moment, I liked the sound of his ribs breaking on my foot. Story 2. The night I chose to remember. When I was in elementary school, I can't specifically remember when, I somehow developed nightmares. I dreamt often that I was abducted by aliens, and that was often enough to terrify me. Their simple appearance and seemingly frightful desire to take me from my family. Now that I'm a full-grown adult, however, I realize there were two very strange patterns around this that I overlooked as a child. Things only the insightful mind of an adult would have thought to look at, and the terrified Wattower M's of a restless child could easily ignore. The first was frightening to realize and perplexes me to this day, dealing with the fact that I had, in fact, never known about aliens before I started having the nightmares. I hadn't even seen E.T. yet, which was obviously a bit strange for my age, but it was the truth. We didn't even own the movie at the time. The thing that worries me even now, how could I have nightmares about an idea I shouldn't have known they existed? The second thing I can remember about those early years is perhaps the more frightening of the two, and is in fact the reason I am here telling this story today. My nightmares, as I mentioned, were reoccurring, but, as I'm sure you've guessed, I have reason to believe they were to real events. That dreadful night, that horrible and awful night, I want so desperately to forget. Before I go further into that night, I should probably briefly give you a background of myself. My name is necessary, and I don't think it matters what I looked like. My family was starting to find its feet. I had both my parents around and doing the best they could for two young children. I was probably 7 or 8, considering my sister was able to walk at the time and is about 5 years younger than me. I slept in the top bunk, she in the bottom, and I would often stay up late at night, feeling so sly my parents never caught me just staring out the curtain window, hypnotized by the glowing effect of street lights through a thin white curtain. It was the perfect American dream, as how to realize, but at the time was just a happy kid. One night, though, I had the most frightening dream. I simply was looking out the window of a building I vaguely recognized to be a variation of my school classroom. Now I know that dreams can work like that, using places from your memory to create something familiar. Yet even if it's an imperfect recreation, you have this feeling that you automatically recognize where you are. For whatever strange reason, it was night, and everyone was in class like normal, lights on so as to ward off the eerie night vibe of it all. That said, things escalated quickly. Rather, I was dropped into the dream during the escalation. I was running to the window, as was everyone else, almost immediately after the power went out and an intense heat glow began emitting from outside that could not have been regular school lights. In my dream, a large, spin-top-shaped flying saucer had landed in the courtyard of our school. I turned, looking slightly to my left out the window, and although it was just a dream, that sight traumatized me all the same. I watched my dad carrying my little sister, as I mentioned, barely able to walk, as he had no doubt come to pick me up from an after-school daycare service I mentioned earlier, was some dream nonsense class taking place at night. But I remember now, it was that after-school program. He saw the saucer, and although I know I witnessed it happen, I can't remember the details of how it happened and can only recall this happening because I feel it like a sixth sense, or perhaps it's just a repressed memory. I only remember the overwhelming feeling of grief as I watched the doors on the alien shuttle open and several little gray men kill my father as he desperately tried to defend my sister. I can't remember what happened to her. I've always assumed she was taken aboard the ship, but I suppose I don't want to know if that isn't true. I must have screamed in my agony, because the aliens turned to look specifically at me through the window. At least I think that's why. Come to think of it, I guess not, because they burst into the room and once more specifically came for me. I don't recall what happened. That's what I dreamed. That's what recurred in my nightmares every so often for about 5 years after the first night I woke up crying. I didn't scream and didn't yell. I just cried as my mom came, and hearing my pitiful sobs to comfort me. I fought the nightmare for a few years, but one night it broke me again, sobbing in fear of something my body refused to let me remember. Then there was a night I cannot forget, that haunts me to this day. I was 13 and headed into high school soon, and I remember my family was packed up and moving the next morning. As a result, I was sleeping on the floor, and even though it was carpet, it was wholly uncomfortable to be on the ground, and I wasn't having an easy time getting to sleep. I've always been one to sleep on my side, maybe my back, but never my stomach, because it always felt like I was going to puke up my own intestines laying on it. Yet that night I woke up uncomfortable and in an odd fashion. I was in the anatomical position laying on my stomach and my head facing to my left. The two things I noticed immediately wrong where I was not, snuggling my favorite stuffed animal, don't judge, and that I was on my stomach. Uncomfortable, I tried adjusting by lifting and twisting my body in the direction my head was laying as I lifted my head in anticipation of this action. However, I met a startling halt. Something extremely stubborn was above my head and pushed my head back down into my pillow. In what I might add was an unusually gentle but mechanically forceful fashion. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. Literally not a sound came from me. Hell, I can't even recall if I opened my mouth. It was like I was paralyzed. Then I noticed the carpet. I could feel the carpet there, but not actually with my body. More, it was like in my dream. My mind recognized that the carpet was there, like a sixth sense, like my mind was being told what I experienced rather than experiencing it myself. This same feeling applied to a light in the room. Although I'd had a lamp in the general direction of the light, I felt I knew it was packed away with the rest of the things in my room for when we moved the next day, with my face in the pillow. And the strange sixth sense-like feeling, my thoughts suddenly rushed the nightmare that I've mentioned was reoccurring up to that point. Before I could make any real connections, though, I suddenly was feeling relaxed and drifted to slumber in seconds, something extremely rare for me. The next morning I didn't remember the events, almost as they weren't important, so I let myself forget. I only suddenly remembered them a few weeks later, almost without warning. I of course realized I should have told my parents. However, I felt the statute of limitations for that had long passed and felt it was too embarrassing to bring up anyways. Honest, I was far too spooked to ever want to think about what may have really happened that night. Story 3. The Diary of a Madman. May 26, 2009. Hello, Diary. My name is Daniel Franklin. I just got this leather-bound beauty of a book in a garage sale. Its covers are smooth and black, the pages yellowed and antique in texture, no doubt a detail I will become fond of as time goes on. Hell, I already like it. Give the book a classical feel, such a delightful thing. Don't you agree? But I digress. Today was just full of ventures to break the rut into which my life had sunk. First, I tried that new eatery on 8th, and then I bought this book at an old, out-of-the-way garage sale in Eatonville. Such a kind old woman selling them, and the cookies she gave to buyers were just delicious. I may go back just to get one, if not to acquire the recipe itself. Well, my cat Bartolome is keeping me company tonight, and I must cut this first, rather short entry to a close. I hope to update this with the memoirs of my life many times. May 27th, 2009. Hello, Diary. Daniel again. Today was as boring as usual. Even my favorite book couldn't alleviate the cloud of boredom over my head. I'm starting to find my best friend, Mark, to be a tad annoying. Mark is nothing special, normal American family man from the suburbs. Is there something wrong with me if I start to take some human beings as disposable? It earlier crossed my mind how uninteresting some of the robotic creatures I liked to keep in my company really are. Ashley, with her endless list of pet names for a latest boy toy, Stuart, his mumbling about the paranormal, UFOs, and the like. Though his theories are interesting, they're still about the same thing every day. Is it really wrong to neck of these beings as just packs of meat that shouldn't have even been given a working brain. Death will be a mercy to them once they reach that fateful day. Wait, what am I writing? The essay or my friends? What the hell came over me? Well, I did stop by that sweet old woman's house today. We shared a plate of some of those delectable cookies with some tea, the flavor of which I just couldn't place. Such a sweet old woman. It is too bad much of her family is dead or has forgotten about her. Her name is Susan Anderson, and her home is filled with so many curiosity, as from the ages of old, and it just fascinates me so. I must go back there again sometime. I must pull this entry to a close. I am still asking myself how I could think such horrible things as I did about my closest co-workers. May 28th, 2009, diary. I am going to be rambling tonight. I woke up because of well, I don't know if this was a bad dream or a good dream. I remember it so vividly, even though dreams have almost never stuck in my head since the days of my puberty, and many of them were less confusing and a little more wet. This one was strange, felt more like a memory than a dream, though before now I hadn't been aware of such a memory. It was when I was barely 5 years old. I was the son of the town butcher. My teenage sister at the time loved me, and I loved her. I never knew she was sad in any way. She always seemed happy enough. I never knew her true thoughts. Even as I write this, I still don't understand. In my dream, I was toddling through the house, but something struck me as being amiss. One of Daddy's knives was missing. I looked up at the wooden knife block, seeing the curious gap in the row of black grips. Daddy always said to tell him when there was a knife gone from his counter. For whatever reason, I didn't pay attention to his rule and continued on in my dream. Suddenly, I was pushing my way into my sister's room. She was on her bed, her arms hanging off of each side of her bed, dripping with some dark red liquid. It looked almost like juice. I walked over and dragged my finger across one of the pools of red liquid before placing my finger in my mouth and sucking. It was not a pleasant taste. Rather, it tasted like some of those shavings left over when Daddy sharpened his knives. The rest seemed to happen in slow motion. Mommy walked in and found us. She screamed and fell on the bed over my sissy. I tugged on her dress. What's wrong, Mommy? Sissy's just sleeping, and she made juice. That's all I remember of the dream. It was chilling. I remember it, and I think I will continue to think about it. I can't shake it. Is it an actual memory that I put behind me? I and still taste the juice in the dream. It tasted heavily of iron, but also sweet. June 9th, 2009, diary. I have an explanation as to why I have been absent. Mark has died. He got in a car crash and bled to death. Oh God, poor little Justine. She's going to be 5 next week, and now she doesn't have a father with whom to spend her birthdays. Mona, his wife, is a wreck. His funeral service is on Sunday. I will miss him dearly. I've known him since we were both just in kindergarten. You see, I have been like a ghost these past couple of days. The boss told me to take some days off from work at the office, at least until after the funeral. It will be hard to cope with this loss. What I believe I will come through all this with my head held high. Story 4. Words in the Dark. Ever since I was small, I've had a fascination with old things, buildings specifically, Something about things that rot and decay is beautiful to me. I don't really know why. As a kid, I'd get into lines the dark, dusty space as I could. The attic, the crawl space in our roof. I'd hide under my bed and read legends about abandoned houses and the ghosts that lived in them. I told my mother that someday I was gonna be an urban explorer. I'd fight ghosts and barely escape from crumbling buildings, take creepy pictures of grand stairways and underground tunnels, find the lair of the Phantom of the Opera and of the Paris Opera, and one evening in September I finally got my chance. I'd been taking a class on architecture in the 18th century, and after a long day creating dust in our local library, I discovered there was a great example of some beautifully classic 18th century architecture right in my own backyard. According to Houses of New Hampshire, the place had been abandoned since the owner, Eric Hunter, had disappeared one night after shutting himself in his library to study an old book he had picked up at an estate sale. He never came out when the house was finally searched. No sign of him was found except his coat hurriedly thrown on a chair. The book was placed almost perfectly in the center of his desk, as if put there with great care. Strangely, the book had no words. All the pages were completely blank. The house was never sold, never demolished, and eventually all but vanished from the minds of everyone as if nothing had ever happened. Of course, I couldn't pass up an opportunity like that without at least poking around a bit. So the next weekend I twisted the arm of my girlfriend, Alex, to come with me to the house. We'd decided it would be best to go at night so there'd be less of a chance of getting caught. I'd packed my new camera and night vision goggles the day before and had everything laid out and ready to go. I know now just how naive I was to think darkness would make me safer. We drove about 10 minutes to the outskirts of town and another 15 or so to reach the old house. We pulled up and got out of the car. As I walked up the driveway, I stared at the house. It was tall, the windows shuttered and dark. The raspberry bushes in the garden had become wild and overgrown, with no one to tend them, growing around the house like a short thorny wall. And there was a large tree in the front yard, one of its branches laying across the pathway leading to the house. I started breaking branches of it to make an open area to climb through when I heard Alex laughing. I looked up to see her standing on the other side of the branch watching me and giggling. "What? How did you get over there?" I asked, snapping a few more branches and climbing through. She pointed. "You could have just walked around it. It was out of the way a bit, but it was quicker than turning it into part of the pathway." She continued to giggle. I glared at her, unable to think of a clever retort. What if I wanted to make it part of the path? She smiled and rolled her eyes. "Then you succeeded." I laughed and took her hand, walking up the steps to the doors. "They're pretty old," I said. "Might take a few good shoves too." The doors swung open with a slight squeak. The entry was large, with small pillars on either side of the interior doorway. There was a staircase not too far from where we stood that appeared to curve into a hallway, and a fireplace with a few chairs, a couch and coffee table, all the things you'd expect to see in an old house like this. A small chandelier hung from the ceiling, covered in cobwebs. It appeared to have broken years ago. one of its sconces laying on the floor in pieces. "Wow, look at this place," I said as we walked through the doors. "Yeah, it's kinda run down. Are you sure it's safe here, Kano?" "Are positive," I smiled at her. "Okay, but I could be home reading a good book with a cup of cocoa instead of whatever we're doing here," she said as she rubbed her arms and shivered. "We're exploring," I said, pulling out my camera to snap a few pictures of the entry and chandelier. "Besides, no one's here anymore. And it's not like this place is an abandoned mental hospital. We'll be fine." I dared further into the room and took some pictures of a dusty mirror and fireplace. "Yeah, I guess you're right. So why did you want me here?" "I don't know. Companionship, someone to share the adventure with. You are my girlfriend after all," I laughed. "Well, that's true," she said, and laughed too. "But it's kinda spooky in here. Can we hurry and get out of here?" "Oh, come on, Alex, look at the furniture. It's got so much character. The peeling wallpaper, the layers of dust everywhere. But if it creeps you out that bad, I'll try and make it quick, 'kay?" I continued walking around the room. I blew the dust off of some boxes on the mantelpiece. I opened one. Filled with ash. "Probably a long dead or something," I mumbled to myself, and opened the one beside it. More ash. On impulse, I poked my finger into it and dug around a bit. I touched something metal and pulled it out. It was a ring. "Hey, Alex, look at this." I turned, still staring at the ring in my hand. I looked up and started to speak. It must have belonged to his wife, but she wasn't there. "Alex." I whirled in a circle, straining my eyes to see into the dark sea corners, but there was no sign of her. Damn it. How did I forget a flashlight? I looked around the room where the moonlight should have illuminated further into the house. There was now a wall of darkness like heavy, black fabric that seemed to shift and groan, as if a great weight were being placed slowly on the floorboards. I put on my night vision goggles and continued walking, trying to get a better look into the rooms, but I couldn't see anything. I pulled off the goggles, starting to panic. I shook them violently before trying again, but still nothing. No height, no comforting familiar shapes, just black, empty silence. I took them off again, shoved them in my bag, and walked hurriedly toward the stairs. I reached them and looked up. I couldn't see anything. She passed the top few steps. After that, there was nothing but complete darkness. I started up the stairs, but as I got further into the darkness, my head started buzzing like a crowd of people whispering, then shouting. I shook my head, trying to clear my mind, and continued up the stairs, but the words kept getting louder and louder. I reached the top of the stairs and ran along the hall, trying to out her. And the darkness, at the end of the hall, I could see a door, a pulsing, sickly light emanating from beneath it. Then it started, the screaming, an awful sobbing scream that went on and on, filling my head and tearing away at my chest, and I realized it was her scream. Alex was screaming, sobbing. She needed me. I stopped at the door, having reached the end of the hallway and willing to argue, and back into the darkness on the stairs. I reached for the door, turned the handle, and pushed. The screaming stopped. It was over. It was okay. I turned my head, looking around the room, and saw it. The eyes were white, staring orbs, its skin yellowed and cracking like old paper, ink dripping from its mouth, nose, and ears. It was Alex, a book at her feet. I turned and reached for the but my hand touched smooth wallpaper. I stared at the wall. Where the door had been, it wasn't there. How the hell could it be gone? I turned, panicking, and looked around the room. There was the door on the opposite wall. I'd have to get past it to get out. I ran, it turned, the door disappeared. I tried again, running from wall to wall, trying to reach the door before it was gone. Every time I moved, it moved the door. Laughter filled my head, and then screaming, that horrible screaming. My eyes darted around the room, looking for some way, any way I could escape. I remembered the book. The tea had to be it. That had to be what had possessed her. If I could throw the book out a window or something, anything, I'd have her back. I'd have Alex back. I lunged for the book, sprawling across the floor and snatching it. I turned on the ground and stared at what used to be my girlfriend. There were black inky tears running down its face now, seeping into the cracks in its skin, its face turning gray, pieces of it starting to fall away like a wet paper doll. I backed against the wall as it inched closer. Using the wall for support, I pulled myself to my feet and felt a handle press head into my back. I didn't care where the door led, but it had to be better than here. It might lead somewhere I could get rid of this horrible book. I pushed on what I thought was the door, and suddenly air rushed in my ears. The cold night seeped through every inch of my clothing, and moonlight so bright my eyes hurt. Then horrible pain, as if every bone in my body was being broken and bent. Then blackness. I could hear whispers, as if by 1,000 people, driving me insane. I wanted to tear at my head, scream and run from it, but I couldn't move. I couldn't see or feel anything except the whispered words in my head as the book pulled me into its pages, and then waited to be seen, examined, trusted, to seep into the mind of anyone who opened it, to everything. The darkness takes everything. Don't go into that darkness. You won't be coming back. Story 5, Candle Cove. Down in the dark, time takes it all, whether you want it tea or not. And in the end there is only darkness. Sometimes we find others in that darkness. Sometimes we lose them there again. Stephen King, The Green Mile. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I'm a grown woman, and I'm well past needing my father to come save me. But even so, I wish he were here now. I guess I never realized before just how much he's always been there for me. Sometimes I wonder, wait, let me start from the beginning. When I was 6 years old, I became obsessed with seeing the pirate show. I overheard a kid at school talking about it. He said it was a puppet show about a little girl who's friends with pirates, and that it was on in the afternoon. Once I heard that, I had to see it. You know how little kids get obsessed with one particular thing for no reason. For me, that thing was Pier 8. I'm still not sure why, but hey, I was 6. The boy did not want to tell me what channel that was on, but after I pestered him enough, he gave in. After school, I ran to the TV to wait for 4 o'clock, but when the time came, nothing was there. The channel was just static. I flipped through all the stations looking for the show. The next day I accused the boy of making the whole thing up, but another girl in the class said no, the show was real, she'd seen it too. I asked her why I couldn't find it, and she didn't have an answer. The boy said that really I shouldn't watch it anyway, but he would not say why, and after that he stopped talking to me at all. Every day for I sat in front of the TV, hoping that the pirate show would magically appear. I even asked Dad to call the local affiliate and ask about it. Dad would do almost anything for me, but they said they'd never heard of it. I was crushed. Months went by, the school year ended, and I became less zealous in my 4 o'clock vigil, but I would still check from time to time. One day I went down to the basement, where Dad kept the old black and white TV in his workroom back. Then I had the idea that different TV sets showed different shows, so I would always check both if I couldn't find what I wanted on. It was 4 o'clock, and I turned to channel 58, just like always, but this time something was different. I heard static, but underneath it, just barely there, I heard music. Strange, bouncy calliope music, and although the channel was still scrambled, I could just barely make out a picture. There, after all this time, was the pirate show. There was the little girl, and there were the pirate marionettes, and there was the ship with the king figurehead. It was just like the kids at school described. Of course, the picture was a mess, and I could only hear half the dialogue, but I didn't care. I was ecstatic. I don't remember much about the program. It was half over by the time I turned it on. The only thing I really do remember was the part where the little girl and the pirate are standing outside of a cave, and the ship tells them, "You have to go inside," just like that. I guess it doesn't sound like much, but at that moment I became very scared, and I turned the TV off and almost ran out of the basement. Suddenly, I wasn't interested in the pirate show anymore. That should have been the end of it. And in fact, I'd like to think that it was. I'd like to think that what happened next was all a dream or the product of a 6-year-old's imagination. For most of the last 40 years, that's exactly what I have thought. But now I've started to wonder. That night, probably around o'clock in the morning, I went to use the bathroom. I was never scared of the dark when I was a kid, and in fact I was a little proud of how I felt brave enough to wander around our old, creaky house with no lights on. On the way back, I noticed that the basement door was open, just a crack, and I heard something down in the basement. It was that strange, jumbled circus music from the show. It was still playing. I stood there for a long time, not sure what to do. I heard the music and the voices of the characters drifting up the basement steps, plain as day. They were very loud, and there was no more noisy static. I told myself that I had simply left the television on, even though I knew I hadn't, and that Dad had somehow missed it before going to bed, even though I knew he never would. Yes, that would almost make sense, except that it didn't explain why a kid should witch up until that afternoon scene never to be on at all would be on at 2 in the morning. I was, as I've said, never a child afraid of the dark or of much of anything else. So despite the strange circumstances, I resolved to go down and turn the old TV off and go back to bed. It didn't seem like a completely good idea, I'll admit, but I certainly wasn't going to run away from a television. I opened the basement door all the way, and would probably have gone down if not for the fact that at the very moment I prepared to put my little bare foot on the first basement step, I heard that voice again. "You have to go inside." but it did not sound as if it were coming from the television. There are limits to what even the bravest 6-year-old will do, and I had reached them. So I ran all the way to Dad's room and woke him up. He listened very calmly to my story, and when I was done he picked me up and carried me with him to the basement door. There was no music now, and no voices, just darkness and silence. He set me down, and as he prepared to go down the stairs, I wanted to stop him. I was sure, all of a sudden, that whatever was down there, I didn't want my daddy to be down there with it. But I couldn't think of anything to say, so I just watched him as he marched down those dark steps, one at a time. I have never been as frightened as I was for those minutes that my father was down in that basement. A part of me was certain he was never coming back. I even imagined that maybe something else would come back instead, but I wasn't sure what. But of course he came back. He said that I'd left the TV on, and just like I thought, I asked him what was on it, and he said nothing, just that, nothing. And then he tucked me back into bed and sang to me and stroked my hair until I fell asleep. I loved my faith very much. After that, I more or less forgot about the whole thing. If it ever crossed my mind in the years to come, I chalked it up as a nightmare. Dad never mentioned it either. There is one thing I noticed, though, that I never really thought about until tonight. Dad got rid of that old TV shortly after. In fact, he stopped watching television altogether, and he stopped working in the basement too. After I went to college, he canceled the service and got rid of the other TV, and as far as I know, never got another one. I wonder about that now, just like I wonder about those times as a little girl when I would catch my father staring off at nothing with his head tilted a little to one side, like he was listening to something, a song or a voice that only he could hear, and I wonder whether it's just my imagination or time tampering with my memories, or if my father didn't have a strange look on his face, and he came out of the basement that night and had his voice quavered a little, and hadn't he been down there just a little longer than it should have taken simply to turn off a television set? I guess those are questions only my father could have answered, and now he never will. Today was his funeral, and that's why tonight, for the first time in 25 years, I'm sleeping in the old house alone. As they lowered his casket into the ground, the unwelcome image of him marching down those basement steps came back to me, and I shivered. This time, when my father went down into the dark, alone, I was sure he would not be back. That was the first time in a long time, I'd thought about the pirate show or the night in the basement. I'd prefer not to keep thinking about it, especially since I have so much else on my mind. But I'm afraid I don't have much choice. You see, when I came in tonight, the basement door was open. I can hear music down there, and voices, ones I haven't heard since I was 6. And I'm sure that if I open the basement door all the way and stand at the top of the stairs, I'll hear another voice telling me that I have to go inside. But I'm sure there is no television down there. I don't want to go. I want to run to my daddy's room and wake him up and have him sing me to sleep again, but of course I can't. I do not think it's a coincidence that this is happening the same day we buried him. I think somehow that this is something my father has been protecting me from for a long time, or maybe not. Maybe there was nothing sinister in the basement 40 years ago. And maybe there's nothing down there now, and gee, maybe this is just the stress of the funeral making me crack. They tell me that grief can induce hallucinations sometimes. It could be there's nothing to be afraid of down in the dark after all. I would very much like to think that that's true. I guess once I go down and see, I'll know for sure. I guess if I don't come back, you'll all know too. Good night, Da Dee. Sweet dreams, I love you. Story 6. Mirror, mirror on the wall, the sounds of sirens slowly faded in the background. I still couldn't believe it. Dave was gone. I made my way to my now empty and currently shed apartment, the police tape now taken down from the entrance of my bedroom. I held the white envelope that was addressed to me. It was from Dave. One of the police officers had handed it to me earlier. I let my fingers roam softly on the flap that opened the letter, debating on whether or not to open it now. Opening the plain door to my bedroom, I placed the envelope on my knit-stand before taking a seat on the edge of my bed and burying my face in my palms. Dave, my best friend and roommate, the person I could trust with anything for over 10 years. How could something like this happen to him of all people? I felt warm tears begin to glide down my face and onto the shabby grayish-purple carpet that the apartment came with. I glanced over to the wall opposite of me, where a Kleenex silhouette of where my mirror used to be presided. As the tears continued flowing silently, I let my mind fade back to the events of the previous couple of hours. Dave was sprawled out on the couch reading one of his cheesy romance novels, looking very focused and intrigued. Typical Dave, I thought to myself. Hey Dave, I'm gonna go to the bookstore. Do you need anything? I asked as I put on my jacket, ready to go out. Dave only lifted his nose out of his book when he heard me take my apartment key out of my jacket pocket. The outsiders. If you can, he responded, finally putting his book down to hand me a 20. You're gonna run out of space in your head after reading all these books, Dave. Dave chuckled before retorting, I wouldn't read so much if you didn't get me a Barnes and Noble gift card. Every year for my birthday, I raised an eyebrow. Would you rather me get something else for your birthday? Dave paused for a moment, his light blonde hair falling over his eyes before he quickly blew the hairs away. No, I like Barnes and Noble. Then don't complain. I shot him a smile, and he chuckled. While walking into the kitchen for what I assume was a drink, I then proceeded to walk outside our flat and to the bookstore. When I got home, Dave was nowhere to be found, and the apartment I had grown accustomed to calling home was in shambles. There was shattered glass all over the ratty carpet, and several things were knocked over and broken. Dave, silence. Dave. Are you here? Are you okay? Once again there was no response, not even the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. When I reached my room, I found the unspeakable. The mirror on my wall had been broken, the reflective shards all over the floor. The shards and carpet were covered in what I would later discover from the police to be Dave's blood, as well as long red grooves in the carpet, grooves that could only be made by someone or something that was being dragged in, attempting to prevent themselves from being taken away by digging their nails into the floor. I called the police soon after. There was a thorough investigation of my apartment, and I was happy to find out that nothing had been stolen, although the police weren't able to find Dave's body. They said that it was likely whoever broke into the apartment stabbed Dave with the broken shards of the mirror. That was also when one of the officers handed me a letter that was on the kitchen floor when they were investigating. It was addressed to me. I could tell by the handwriting on the envelope that it was from Dave. After several hours of further investigation, the police finally let me into my home, which brought me to my current situation. I found it a bit sad, actually, that Dave would be stabbed with mirror shards. He hated mirrors, was scared to death by them. In fact, my mirror was the only one in the flat. Dave usually relied on looking at his reflection in the window or in the toaster, pots, pans, anything that was reflective. With the exception of mirrors, a few of our friends and I always thought that was exceptionally weird. So one day, when we were kids in high school, I got around to asking him what his deal with mirrors was. Hey Dave, I began somewhat awkwardly. Yeah, Nate, he chirped, his head popping up its fixated stare on the paper he was doodling on. Can I ask you a personal question? I twiddled my thumbs and stared down at the wooden desk in front of me. Yeah, sure, what is it? Dave replied, nonchalantly with his award-winning smile plastered on his face. Why are you so afraid of mirrors? I mean, they can't do anything to you, man. Dave's smile instantly fell, and his face held a grim expression. His lips were slightly parted as if he wanted to say something, but he remained silent. He turned his gaze away from me and ran his fingers through his stick-straight blonde hair, his dark brown eyes appearing cloudy and distant. The small interval of silence felt like hours, but was really only a few minutes. I felt bad for asking Dave about this, knowing it was probably something personal, and I was probably more than a little insensitive. Dave, I'm sorry, you don't have to. He cut me off promptly. When I look into the mirror, I don't see myself staring back. I wasn't really sure what he meant by that. I assumed it might be some sort of mental disorder he had, considering Dave was really pale and skinny, and was lacking in the strength department. Even though Dave ate a lot, he could never gain weight or muscle, despite his efforts, leaving him to have a vampire's complexion and the body of a twig, which, as you can imagine, did make him the heartthrob or MVP of the school. In fact, people would occasionally pick on him for it. He made up for all of that with smarts, charm, humor, and just all around being a good guy. He wasn't unattractive, just wimpy, for lack of a better word. I thought maybe he was just beating on himself too much. But when I asked him what he meant, he just stared at me with his big brown eyes. He inhaled deeply and let out a shuddering breath. When I look into the mirror, I don't see me. I see some sort of twisted version of me staring back. It's got the same basic appearance of me, but the whites of its eyes are obsidian black, and the irises are a blinding shade of glowing bright yellow. It's got twisted black ram's horns coming from its head, and its ears are pointed and flare out to the side like some sort of demented elf. And every time I look in the mirror, it smiles back at me. Sometimes it reach out its hand, hoping that I'll take it so it can pull me in, but I won't, not ever. So I never look in the mirror, because the hand looks more inviting every time I do. Never had Dav. He looked more serious than in that moment, and I could tell from his ragged breaths and watery eyes that he wasn't lying. I decided to not bring up the subject again, realizing it was a sensitive subject, and I really didn't want to know about whatever twisted hallucinations Dave had when he looked in the mirror. So years later, when college came around and Dave and I wanted to share a flat, I understood that if there was going to be a mirror in the small apartment, it would be in the confines of my bedroom. I glanced to the letter on my nightstand once more. I lethargically picked up the envelope. With shaking hands, I bit my quivering lip and wiped my wet eyes, forcing myself to stop crying. Nathan Reynolds was written on the back of it in small blocky handwriting. I.T. The flap open and pulled out the piece of paper that were Dave's last words. Dear Nate. I looked in the mirror. I couldn't stop myself. It's coming to take me now. There's no avoiding it. Nate, you've always been my best friend. No one else would talk to me until you came along in 7th grade. It's broken the mirror. Nate, I can hear its footsteps becoming nearer. Tell my family I love them, and please don't. The letter stopped there. He couldn't even finish his last words. But surely that thing Dave always talked about couldn't be real. He was hallucinating. Right, but where is Dave? What happened to him? I put the letter back onto my nightstand and sighed. Today was a long day. I got up and meandered into the kitchen, looking through the cabinets for some NyQuil to help me sleep. When I found said item, a pale hand similar to Dave's rested on my shoulder. I froze. Every joint in my body became paralyzed. Dave, I managed to squeak out. I slowly turned around only to be met with a pair of black eyes, a ring of glowing yellow standing out in each of them. The creature looked strikingly similar to Dave and sported a pair of jet black spiral horns and big pointed ears. The thing's straight blonde hair fell in front of its eyes much like it did with Dave, and its pale bony figure was adorned with the same ruddy jeans Dave was wearing before I went to pick up his book. It smiled at me with glistening white teeth, a smile filled with pure malice and hatred. It was covered in several cuts and scratches, blood pouring from the wounds, but it was also covered in the blood of my best friend since 7th grade. A couple of sharp mirror shards were protruding from its shoulders, forearms, and back, and I noticed that the beast's hand resting on my shoulder had turned into a vice grip. It pulled me closer, the same putrid smile plaster on the demon's face. As our faces were mere inches apart, he creature cackled, not quite. Story 7. Tharbles. So, here's a quaint little story I'm only now recollecting for the first time in my adult life, having faded slowly in the memory since the event actually occurred on one day during my teenage years. I was 11. And it was the summer that existed immediately before my first year of secondary school was due to start. Having been an academic boy of sorts, Mother, keen to ensure this desirable trait, continued to encourage me to start my preparation of the educational year almost as soon as my previous one had ended. I'm not ashamed to admit, even now, that my relentless pursuit of intelligence and resulting lack of social graces was done purely as a means to make her proud, and never once in order to develop my own enjoyment of life as such. When I saw in the paper that the ever-popular paranormal expert Professor Luke Kane was hosting a talk in my local community hall. I jumped at the opportunity to attend, if only to find out what on earth paranormal meant, as the subject was not included on my junior school curriculum. To a wired frame boy like myself, the hall was vast, so vast in fact that I was sure if a bird ever stumbled into it, it should live the rest of its days under the illusion of complete, limitless freedom. I was amongst the last to arrive, and so took my seat as quickly and discreetly as possible before. Mere seconds later, Professor Kane took to the stage. He was dressed in a long, cloak-like outer jacket which made any other garments beneath it aesthetically redundant, though I was confident he was wearing some, and a top hat that he never once removed during the whole presentation. He looked the epitome of knowledge, and the silence that befell his entrance confirmed a similar reputation. He spoke well, with a literacy that even I, at the zenith of scholastic understanding, found hard to understand. In places I felt myself becoming clever with every word, and I couldn't help but look forward to returning home and relaying all that I'd learnt to Mother at dinner. She will be so impressed, I thought. It was at a point about halfway through proceedings that Professor Kane asked in a rhetorical manner I did and still believe whether anyone in the audience had lagged behind in their grasp of his explanation as to why ghosts couldn't possibly exist. In typical English resolve, no one dared speak up, although I was certain not everyone could have followed such a convoluted theory. However, a hand was raised atop an arm belonging to an old lady sitting 3 or 4 rows ahead of me. Professor Kane, though slightly miffed at the situation, humored it. "What of Tharbles?" asked the lady. "Tharbles?" answered the professor. "What are Tharbles?" "Tharbles," said the lady, "are the little goblin creatures we can't see. What are there, you know, not invisible, but real good at hidin'. They're on our shoulders, Mr. Kane." The professor was knocked well off his stride at this line of questioning. He tried to brush it off in a professional manner, but the lady, observing that no one was accepting her inquiries as genuine, continued determinedly, "You haven't heard o' the goblins Tharbles. The goblins that are with us now, and when we go home they'll be here, and when we eat and sleep and brush our teeth, they'll be there as well. They're watching us, goblins, madam, the little green creatures that populate our children's fairy tales. You believe that they are watching us?" asked Professor Kane. "They are." "And where are they now, if they are watching us?" "I don't see them. I mean, in this room right now." "There'll just be the one," insisted the old lady, "and it'll be on the back of the man in the furthest corner of the room, so as to see everyone and not be seen itself. See, I confide in you now that when the old lady spoke of this ghoulish entity and its mannerisms, dwelling solely in her imagination or not, my spine shivered and 1 or 2 hairs stood to attention toward the back of my neck. Well, thank you for how question, dear lady, but I rather think you've been reading too many fantasy books. There are no such things as Tharbles, I can assure you," said the professor. "That's what you wish, 'cause you ain't ever seen one," said the lady, with a certain amount more bullishness than before. "This is a Tharble world. They don't like us, so they kill us. Have done for centuries and will do forever." Murmurs erupted, as much as murmurs can erupt throughout the audience. I assume that these side-mouthed conversations most likely center on the old lady's mental capacity, and how sad it was that with age, see, I'm a delusional state like the one she was portraying. What do you mean, kill us? Asked one faceless man from the crowd. The woman laughed, I recall, in a manner reserved only for the most ludicrous suggestions and side-splitting jokes. Why'd you think we all got a habit of dying, man? Old age is what the doctors'll tell you, but I know trees as old as my long-dead pa still standin'. The Tharbles are there, behind your shoulder or leanin' on your head, pullin' your strings till the day they get you. The professor sighed, and I remember being comforted by the gesture. He clearly felt the old lady had a great deal more than one screw loose, lending fuel to my hopes that what she was saying was the simple ramblings of an overactive imagination and nothing more. It was unfortunate that the situation had now grown to be unsustainable, and Professor Kane had to request the old lady be escorted from the hall by a pair of gentlemen whom I guessed to be general overseers of the building. Whilst being almost literally dragged away, the lady berated Professor Kane and the audience as a whole, actually for rejecting what she'd said, despite her having taken a great risk in saying it. The rest of the presentation continued without a hitch, and a great deal of brain-achingly in-depth topics later. The hall was vacated, and I returned home to Mother. I remember talking eagerly and without pause over our cabbage soup about what I'd learnt, or what I thought I'd learnt, from my evening with the great Professor Luke Kane. The conversation must have been fascinating, as I distinctly remember my baby sister Jade nodding in and out of consciousness throughout its course. It wasn't until I was mopping up the excess soup in my bowl with a buttered slice of bread that the old lady forced herself into the forefront of my mind. With nothing else to say, I relayed all the lady's thoughts to Mother there, and then Mozart, to my surprise, listened intently to every word as though I were spilling some sort of secret truth to her for the first time. I couldn't help but notice her intense reaction. You don't believe it, do you? I asked. She smiled, the kind of disingenuous smile a child can always tell is meant for their comfort and so does little to comfort them. Do you remember your father? She asked. A little round fellow he was, and bald as a coot. I could remember him very well, in fact, but I wondered how he, a man 18 months dead, related to Tharbles. He spent much of his time alone, an introverted person, I think they call it, locked up in his study for days on end, and before he, Mother's use of in this instance mean, hung himself with an old belt. He swore he was being driven loony by the constant feeling that something was pressing down on his shoulders and head. I argued the point that doctors had said Father's brain was broken down, medicine at the time not being nearly as precise as it is these days, and he never thought straight about a single thing since before I could remember right up until his death. But what, I pressed, does this have to do with what the old lady called Tharbles? Mother proposed that the reason my father died so young, the reason he was once a 6-foot-tall, long-haired 20-year-old that ended up being buried a 5-foot-5, bald 36-year-old, was because he, the lonely man he became, had a Tharble with him, on him, for the vast majority of his adult life. I couldn't accept it. If this is true, then where is the Tharble that is supposedly watching us right now? I asked. Like the old lady said, there's always at least one. Keep your eyes on me, just as mine are on you," said Mother. "And suppose your baby's sister, in her high care right now, all but fast asleep, has her head tilted slightly down, as though something is weighing upon it." A few seconds passed as we both wrestled with the urge to check on the dear little girl. Mother caved first, and as she did, my spine shivered, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up just as they did in the community hall. I turned to little Jade as well. She was sitting completely alone and drifting off as babies do in that adorable, regretful manner. Mother smiled, and I smiled back, and the idea that she had just been playing a cruel joke on me from the very start started to grow in my subconscious. We washed up together before I took Jade to her cot in Mother's room, kicking her in and kissing her on the forehead, then turning the lights out and leaving her to sleep. I had a bath and used the time to go over that day's events, but it wasn't until I grabbed my toothbrush from beside the sink that I noticed again a shiver run down my back and the hairs on my neck standing on end. It was then that I realized I had been the person sitting in the furthermost corner of the community hall. I was the only one not being watched at when Mother looked to Jane during that moment at dinner, and as I turned to brush my teeth, I had looked upon myself in the bathroom mirror, and once again felt a terrible force to hide himself behind my back.